The summer of 1927 was not supposed to yield anything extraordinary along the lower Missouri. The river had come up in the spring, as it always did, fed by snowmelt from the Rockies and hard rains across the northern plains, pressing out across the bottomland, where farmers had planted early and hoped for the best. By late June, after the rains stopped and the mountain water finished coming down, the Missouri began to pull back. It does this every year to some degree. The channel narrows, the exposed banks widen, and the sandbars appear in the bends where the current slows. But in the summer of 1927, between the week of the 4th of July and the last days of August, the river pulled back farther than the oldest residents of Saline County, Missouri, could account for in their own living memories. The channel did not merely narrow. It retreated by 100 yards or more along certain bends, exposing ground that the river had held beneath it for years, perhaps for decades, perhaps for longer than anyone could say with confidence. And along a half-mile stretch of the southern bend, running roughly east of the town of Marshall, in the direction the river makes before it curves back toward the bluffs, the retreating water uncovered a surface that appeared in no geological survey ever filed on that ground, in no county record, in no river chart. A man named Eldon Marsh, who farmed the bottomland east of the river road and had worked the same ground since his father's deed came to him in 1911, walked down to the exposed bank on a morning in mid-July to check what the low water had done to his lower fence line. He knew this walk exactly. He knew the grade, the low spots where water pooled after heavy rain, the pale strips of gravel that showed up in dry summers, the smell of the exposed river mud going over to something cracked and sharp in the heat. What he found that morning he had not seen before, and could not, in any conversation afterward, find an explanation for that, satisfied him. Set into the exposed riverbed, running from the current waterline out at an angle toward the far bank, there was a surface. Not sand, not gravel, not the compressed grey clay that hardened in bends and had fooled people on other rivers. This was fitted stone, cut flat, laid in courses, and it ran in both directions along the bend, as far as Marsh could see, before the river took it under again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marsh went back to his farmhouse and told his wife what he had found. Then he walked to the house of his nearest neighbor, a man named Clarence Wick, who ran cattle on the higher ground north of the river road, and told him too. Both men returned to the exposed bank that afternoon. Wick brought a length of river cane to probe the surface, the kind of thing you reach for when you want to know what is under you without committing your full weight to it. What the cane met was solid and did not yield the way river sediment yields. It rang dull and firm, consistent under the probe as far as Wick could reach from the bank. He stepped out onto the surface, testing his weight the way you would test early-season ice, placing each foot carefully and waiting before shifting his balance. And the stone held him without flexing, without the soft compression that river deposits give under a grown man's weight. He walked 15 paces out toward the far bank before the footing went underwater again, and he said later, in an account that a local historian named Doris Cantwell collected in the 1970s, that the surface ran continuously beneath the water without any break that his cane could find, running on at the same angle and the same level as far as he could probe. The two men stood on the exposed south bend of the Missouri River in July of 1927 and looked at a stone road. Marsh described the individual stones as roughly the size and thickness of a good hearthstone, though cut squarer at the corners than any hearthstone he had ever worked with. Some were light grey, and some carried a yellowish tinge he associated with the limestone that came out of the river bluffs upstream near Arrow Rock. The surface was not smooth in the way a poured or machine-finished road is smooth. The stones were set tight against one another, their edges trimmed to meet without large gaps, and the joints between them had been packed with a dark, dense material, pressed down flush with the face of the stone, so that the whole surface read as one continuous fitted floor, rather than a collection of placed rocks. He said the fill material was harder than he expected and darker than the river silt around it, and it had not washed out in whatever span of time the surface had spent submerged. The stones themselves were clean, not in the way something recently uncovered is clean, but free of the organic crust he would have expected to find matted into the joints of a surface that old. Wherever these stones had come from, and however long they had been down there, the water had not moved them, and the fill between them had not given way. Clarence Wick returned the following morning with his son and a length of rope knotted at 1-foot intervals. They measured what they could access from the bank and from the shallows. The exposed portion ran for just over 60 feet along the bank before the river covered it to the east, and for just under 40 feet before it vanished westward into deeper water. The total visible surface, the part above the waterline that morning, was slightly more than 100 feet of continuous stone pavement running at an angle across the bottom of the Missouri River. Wick's son waded the western end and measured the water depth above the continuation of the surface at 18 inches at the near edge, deepening steadily toward mid-channel. The surface was still there under him, solid and unbroken underfoot, at the same level and the same character as the exposed section. At the width it held, 15 feet of dressed stone set in a prepared bed and filled flush, it was not a natural formation of any kind that any of the men who walked it that week had the vocabulary to explain. Word moved along the river road the way it always does, farm to farm and house to house, and by the third week of July, several dozen people had come down to the South Bend to see it for themselves. A retired schoolteacher from Marshall named Vera Sutter walked the exposed section twice on consecutive mornings and noted in a letter to her sister in St. Joseph that the stones near the waterline showed what she described as tooling marks along their upper edges, clean parallel striations, she said reminded her of a dressed stone sill she had seen years before on a demolished building in Kansas City. A farmer named Lloyd Hess, who kept ground to the west of Wick's property, said the stones had a regularity to their thickness that he found hard to account for by any natural process he was aware of. He was not a geologist and said so, but he had quarried limestone from the bluffs with his father as a young man, and he knew the difference between a stone that had been worked and a stone that had not. What he was looking at, he said, had been worked. Several people walked the full length of the exposed section and reported that the surface maintained consistent width and level across its entire visible run, without any of the irregularity you would expect from a natural deposit. The stones did not thin toward the edges. The fill did not vary. The angle of the surface relative to the current channel was constant. Hess told Cantwell, when she interviewed him in the winter of 1976, that he had never found an explanation for what he saw that summer, and that in 50 years of thinking about it, he had arrived at only one conclusion. Someone had built it. Among those who arrived at the bend, eventually, was a county surveyor named Harold Pruitt, who came with a transit and a notebook and spent most of a morning working the exposed section. Pruitt's field notes from that morning have not been located in any county archive. What survives is a brief item published in the Marshall Democrat News in the last week of July 1927, recording that an unusual stone formation had been found on the south bend of the river during the low water period, that several residents had examined it, and that a determination of its origin was pending further inspection. The item is 4 sentences long. There is no follow-up item in any subsequent issue. The paper's archive for August of that year is otherwise intact. What Pruitt said privately, according to Marsh's account relayed years later to Cantwell, was that the stones were dressed. That was the word he used, dressed. It means someone had worked them, had cut their faces flat and trimmed their edges before they were placed. River stone does not dress itself in the bed of the Missouri. Glacial till does not dress itself. Water does not produce fitted joints or flush-packed fill, or the consistent dimensional tolerances that Wick and Hess and Pruitt all independently noted. What Pruitt found that morning, and recorded in field notes that do not appear in any public record, was that someone had shaped stone and laid it in a prepared roadbed under what is now the Missouri River, and that based on the depth of sediment above the still submerged continuation of the surface, the road had been there long enough to accumulate an overburden of several feet. He did not say who had built it or when. He did not publish his findings. What happened to his field notes from that morning is not recorded anywhere. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Army Corps of Engineers arrived in the first week of August. Their presence in Saline County that summer was not, in itself, unusual. The floods of 1927 had been the most destructive the lower Mississippi had seen in the historical record, and the Corps was moving through the entire river system with expanded authority to assess channel conditions and plan new flood control infrastructure. A team was assigned to the south bend of the Missouri near Marshall as part of what the Corps regional log describes as a routine channel geometry and sediment load assessment. They arrived on a Monday, they stayed 4 days, they measured, they photographed, they collected samples. Wick's son, who helped carry equipment for the team on the second day of their work, noted in a letter written many years later to a Missouri Historical Society that at least 2 members of the team spent part of that second day on the exposed stone surface with measuring instruments, and that one of them used a chisel and a canvas sample bag to take material from the fill between the stones and from the face of one of the larger stones near the waterline. He also noted that the lead engineer, whose name he did not record, asked Wick's father specifically whether anyone had contacted newspapers in Kansas City or St. Louis about the formation. Wick's father said no. The engineer wrote something in a small notebook and said nothing more on the subject. The Corps log for the Missouri River Saline County survey segment, a portion of which Cantwell obtained through a records request in the 1970s, covers the 4 days of work at the South Bend. The measurements and notations are consistent with standard survey practice. There is no mention of a stone formation. There is no mention of dressed material, of samples collected, of photographs taken at the waterline, of any conversation with residents about the feature. The log records the channel depth at several measured points, the width at those points, the bank sediment character, and the anticipated effect of proposed upstream levee adjustments on flow velocity. It is methodical and internally complete. What it does not contain uniformly and without gaps. The log for those 4 days at the South Bend is clean. What multiple witnesses agree the team spent part of 2 working days measuring and removing material from is simply not in it. What the Corps did in the weeks that followed is in the documented record. Between the 2nd and 4th week of August 1927, levee work at 2 locations upstream was completed ahead of its projected schedule. The authorized work had already been underway before the team arrived at the South Bend. But the sequencing of the final closures, the specific order in which the upper levee segments were sealed, and the redirected volume entered the South Bend channel, that sequencing brought the water up at the Marshall site faster than a normal end-of-season rise would produce. Wick's son recorded it. The surface went under on a Thursday. By the following Monday, the water was 4 feet above it, and nothing of the stone was visible from the bank. It did not re-emerge that season. There is no documented record of the surface being seen at any point since. This would be a narrower story if it were the only one of its kind. But the lower Missouri and the upper Mississippi are not simple ground. The cultures that occupied the central river valleys in the period between roughly 1,000 and 800 years ago, the people archaeologists call Mississippian, built with earth and stone on a scale that still shows above the surface in some places and lies below it in many others. Cahokia, which sits in the American Bottom 40 miles east of what is now downtown St. Louis, is the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Its central mound covers 14 acres at the base. It occupied ground that has flooded repeatedly since it was abandoned near the end of the 13th century. The roads and causeways connecting the central mound complex to the outlying communities, the engineered surfaces linking the ceremonial plazas to the river landings and the agricultural districts, are documented in the archaeological literature and visible in aerial photographs taken in the 1940s and 50s before suburban development covered the last exposed sections. They are documented in Works Progress Administration land surveys of the 1930s that mapped the American Bottom in sufficient detail to show remnant outlines of prepared surfaces that had been buried and reburied by river sediment for 600 years, and those surfaces do not stop at the edge of the American Bottom. The engineering tradition that built Monk's Mound extended across the entire central river system, and the material evidence of it is still coming up in creek cuts and highway excavations and dredge operations across the region, found in fragments and recorded in a sentence or two, disposed of because it is in the way, and never followed to its end. In 1938, an engineer working on a bridge approach at a Missouri River crossing in Howard County described in a personal letter to a colleague in Kansas City a layer of what he called flagged stone encountered at a depth of roughly 6 feet in the riverbank during excavation. The layer was horizontal, extended at least 30 feet in either direction before the excavation limits cut it off, and was broken up and removed as part of the project because it fell within the bearing layer that had to be cleared. He assumed it was the remnant of an old ferry landing or a boat ramp, the kind of practical infrastructure that settlers built at river crossings. He noted it in the letter because the stone had a worked quality and the extent of it seemed larger than any landing he could account for. His letter is held in a private collection in Jefferson City. No formal investigation of the Howard County site was ever initiated. Farther north, in 1951, a core dredging operation, clearing a channel segment near the Iowa-Missouri border, brought up dressed limestone blocks from a depth of 15 feet below the current bed of the Missouri River. The blocks were measured and photographed at the dredge platform by a Corps surveyor whose name appears in the project file held at a regional archive in Kansas City. They were deposited on the spoil bank with the rest of the dredge material. The project file notes their presence in 2 sentences and records that no further action was required. The spoil bank was later graded and incorporated into a levee extension. The photographs are in the file. The 2 sentences are the complete extent of what the institutional record says about dressed limestone blocks recovered from 15 feet under the bed of the Missouri River. What they were, what they connected to, what else lies at that depth in that segment of the channel, the record does not address. What connects these 3 instances, the South Bend surface of 1927, the Howard County flagging of 1938, the Iowa-Missouri blocks of 1951, is not a coordinated decision to conceal them. Nothing in the record supports that conclusion, and this account does not make that claim. What the record does support is something narrower and, considered in full, more difficult to set aside. Each find was treated as a logistical obstacle or a brief curiosity rather than a question worth following. The road went back under because the water management schedule proceeded on its timeline. The flagging was broken up because it fell within the excavation footprint. The blocks were spoiled because that is what dredge material is for. No system needed to act against these things. The system simply had no category for fitted stone roads under the Missouri River, and without a category, the material had nowhere to go except out of the way. The Missouri River has been the most actively managed large waterway on the continent for over a century. The Corps of Engineers has dredged it, channeled it, levied it, and rerouted it more thoroughly than any comparable river system in North America. Since the 1930s, the channel has been shortened by roughly 127 miles through the removal of natural meanders. The river's tendency to migrate across its floodplain, to scour one bank and deposit on another, to expose what is buried and bury what is exposed, in the seasonal rhythm that Eldon Marsh understood from 30 years of working the bottomland east of his river road. That tendency has been engineered out of the Missouri as completely as any natural process has ever been removed from a river. What that means for the ground beneath it is that the kind of low water exposure that brought the South Bend surface into view in July of 1927 now operates within much narrower limits. The seasonal amplitude of the channel has been reduced. The window in which a buried feature can break the surface is shorter and occurs less often. What could once be seen on a dry summer morning stays under. Eldon Marsh died in 1953. His farm passed out of the family in the mid-1960s, and the bottomland east of the river road is now under a Corps levee easement. Doris Cantwell spent the better part of several years in the 1970s trying to bring the county record, the Corps archive, and the witness accounts into the same conversation. She published a 4-page account in a Missouri Historical Journal in 1979. It received no institutional response of any kind. Cantwell moved on to other research, and her papers are held at the State Historical Society of Missouri in Columbia. The South Bend file is there in a box with her other river work, and among the materials in that box there is a photocopy of the 4-sentence item from the Democrat News, a hand-traced copy of a levee segment diagram, and a note in Cantwell's own handwriting that reads, simply, "The stones are still there." The Missouri River at the South Bend of Saline County is running today at its managed level, within its engineered banks, its seasonal variation controlled within the limits the flood control program requires. Somewhere below the current riverbed, under the years of sediment that have settled since the water came back up in August of 1927, a fitted stone surface runs from one bank toward the other at an angle that no geological process put there, and no settler-era construction project ever built at that depth. The stone has been there long enough to accumulate an overburden of several feet. It is dressed, it is set in a prepared bed, it runs at a width of 15 feet, sufficient to carry whatever moved across the Missouri River along that route before the river became what anyone living has ever seen it to be. The samples the core team placed in a canvas bag, that August went somewhere, the photographs went somewhere, the lead engineer wrote something in a small notebook and said nothing more. Whatever he wrote, wherever those materials ended up, they are not in the public record. The log says 4 days of routine assessment. Channel geometry and sediment load. Nothing unusual to report. The stones are still there. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.